Hi again. I wanted to talk a little bit about the assignment, especially the one coming up now, February 9, for persons working in a pastoral interest. That assignment is autobiographical, a few pages telling your story in a way that connects you with immigrant reality and in a way that tells your story as an immigrant story. This is something I've been thinking through for a couple of years now. When it seems to me that so much of the political rhetoric around immigration sets people who look like me as non immigrants, as natives, over against various new groups, various brown persons who are the immigrants. And it is a separation of us and them. As political rhetoric, that gets in the way of us finding any large solution. In as a biblical reading, it just gets in the way of us making sense of the biblical text. One of the core values of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament that follows out of that is an old confession found in Deuteronomy that our father was a wandering Aramean. The entire identity that is core to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Bible, is that of wanderers, immigrants, refugees, slaves. If we don't read as immigrants, we're not going to make sense of almost any page out of the Bible. Because the Bible is proclaiming an immigrant identity, we need to be in touch with our own immigrant identity in order to make sense of Scripture in any real way, academically or for practical application. So I'm asking you to rethink your own personal story as an immigrant story. The challenge, well, to be upfront, for many of you in the class, when you tell your story, you've always told it as an immigrant story. For people like me, it's harder. My parents would be shocked to hear me talking about myself as an immigrant. They in their lives resisted immigrant as a label and would have fought against it. Now, I've been shaped in my own life, and I could tell my own life story in terms of the various places I've moved to, all within the United States. But I grew up as a Californian, became a resident of Oregon, and then Tennessee, Oklahoma. After Oklahoma came Kentucky, Missouri, New Jersey, Kentucky again, and back to California. All of those are different places, different cultures, different ways of life, different words for things. I had to keep learning. And to some extent, a lot of my life has been the difficulty for most of my adult years in putting down roots, in feeling like a native. I have felt like an outsider in a number of places. And, or if not an outsider, at least one of the new people in town. I didn't have the networks, I wasn't related to people, I felt I was on my own. And for those who keep moving, that's a common experience. I think it would be better if, in telling the story of immigration, I focused some on my grandfather Berquist's story. I never knew him. He passed away early in my life. He was he grew up in the early 1900s in Omaha, Nebraska, which was a pretty good-sized town for a while at that time. He was educated. by the standards of his day. He had an office job. Um, he did some. He also did some delivery work, taking milk out and leaving it on people's doorsteps. That would have been carrying it by horseback. And then he joined the First World War and had the experience of being a soldier in trenches in France. It changed him. There was a box he kept under his bed through the rest of his life. He never opened it. He never showed it to anyone. He never let anybody touch it. It was after he passed away that we learned he was still keeping his army gas mask underneath his bed through the rest of his life. His experience in war changed him. Today, I think we'd call it PTSD. But there's a trauma that comes from moving. There's a price we pay for mobility. And I didn't realize it. I think he paid that price his whole life. When he came back from the war, there was the Homestead Act, which meant that soldiers, veterans, could claim land if they could find unoccupied land and live on it for a year or for a couple of years. And so he, after he got out of the war, went to Omaha, saw family, and though he had been successful there before, he didn't fit in as a veteran. So he got on the train and went west until the last stop in Nebraska. And he got off at that stop and he took the money he had left and he bought a horse and a shovel. And he rode the horse north until it died. And there he stayed. It was land where nobody lived. He ended up with about 10 acres of really bad farmland. His first winter, he dug a hole with that shovel, about 6 feet deep, about 6 feet long, and he slept there. He had a gun, and he could shoot animals to eat, start his own fires, eventually build a wood covering over that hole in the ground. Over the next few years, he expanded that hole in the ground and then built the first wooden room over top of it, and what had been his home for years became the basement. That house stood for many years. He married, and his one son was born, all in that one room. They were, a few years later, able to do well enough in farming that in the early 20th century, he bought a larger farm, and their life went on. But he spent formative years not only in the foxholes in France, but then in a foxhole of his own making in Nebraska. His experience of being displaced changed his life. It led to a self-reliance that may not have been healthy for him in the long run. He had a hard time trusting people. He had a hard time thinking others were as tough as he was. I never met my grandfather, and I certainly don't know the generation before him and the generation before that, the ones who came to America. But my dad and I did a lot of genealogical research. Those two generations in which a number of our family came over from Sweden, relocated, coming through Ellis Island in the 1800s. Some early, some mid to late 1800s. They ended up in places in the far west, like Illinois Wisconsin. And in those places, they were farm laborers. They had left Sweden because they were starving, because famine and drought had hit the land. And spending what money they had left to get to another country was their only chance at living. They came as economic refugees, seeking the work that Americans weren't willing to do, and that was farm labor. I have seen the I've seen the census records of my ancestors in their first generation in the U.S., just 4 generations ago. They lived in barracks, in what might be considered a good-sized living room. There were 20 of them sleeping at night. They did not speak English, and so they had an English-speaking overseer, taskmaster, foreman, who would manage the group of them on the farm. As farm hands, they worked chained together, and they weren't able to communicate in their own language with their foreperson. The census records counted those barracks this way. They counted up the number of men there, and they would say if there's 28 in the room, they just called them all Sven, a good Swedish name. They didn't bother learning individuals' names. They didn't bother giving anybody a last name. They didn't bother listing ages. They would just say 28 Sven. If they had, in years after that, wives and children, they'd be listed as 28 Sven and others. They weren't even worth counting. That kind of immigrant story has changed my life, has made me look at all of this differently. It makes me look at immigrant farm laborers and say, these are my people. My great-grandparents were living in barracks. They were chained together. They were afraid to give their names to the authorities, and the authorities didn't care about their names. They were undocumented back before that was such a bad thing. I challenge you to think about your own story, to think about those ancestors maybe just a little further back than you've heard about. Were they farmers? And by that, did they own a farm or work on someone else's farm? If they worked on someone else's farm, there's a chance that the old slave narratives of the 1800s or the migrant farm workers of today are more like how our ancestors lived than we care to admit. Were they factory workers, miners, fisher people? All of those were very dangerous jobs. And without any sort of protections as to workplace safety or reasonable hours. So I'm asking you, tell your own story. Get in touch with the ways that your ancestors, and that maybe you, have a shared immigrant experience. What we'll be doing as we're looking through biblical texts in the week to come is a process of reading biblical stories and recognizing these characters as immigrants. If you grew up like me, afraid to think of yourself as an immigrant, afraid to think that we knew any immigrants or had any immigrant friends, you need to retell your own story before you can read the Bible with the empathy and the ability to let the Bible shape the reader's identity, our own identity, as persons who are immigrants, belonging to no nation and only to God.